All right, so now we are ready to get going with the second video where we're going to look at the construction of the lungs and then some of the processes involved with ventilating the lungs. And then finally we'll discuss the capacities and the volumes that we associate with the lungs. So let's get started. The lungs have a very lightweight kind of consistency, very spongy consistency, because they are primarily air-filled passageways that are surrounded by the connective tissues, elastic connective tissue primarily. And all the elastic fibers allow for great changes. Lots of stretching can occur in lung tissue, and then the tissues will snap back to their previous size and shape. It's enclosed, the lungs are enclosed in the thoracic cage, which is built of the bones, the ribs, and the sternum, and the spine, and the muscles that hold and surround and move those bones, as well as the diaphragm, which separates the thoracic and the abdominal cavities. Each lung is found in its own pleural cavity. So each lung has its own pleural cavity, and the cavity is lined by serous membranes, the pleura of the lungs. The right lung is slightly larger and divided into 3 lobes, while the left lung is slightly smaller and divided into only 2 lobes. And so, looking in the book, the diagrams in the book do a really good job of kind of showing where those lobes are. So each lung, again, rests in its own pleural cavity. It's a sealed cavity, and it's lined by serous membrane. So if we think about the lungs, here's the trachea coming down to the right and left main bronchi, and there's a sealed cavity that encloses the lungs. And the lining of the cavity is lined with parietal pleura, and the lungs themselves are covered with visceral pleura. Go away. There we are. Sorry, sometimes I activate little things that I don't understand how they got activated. Here we are. So there's the visceral pleura that covers each of the lungs. The lungs look a little shrunken there. Sorry, bad drawing, but you get the idea, I hope. So here is the visceral pleura, and here is the parietal pleura. And there's almost no pleural cavity at all. It is the book describes it as a potential space. The pleura come almost into very close contact with each other, but there's just a little bit, very thin layer of pleural fluid, which is a thin, slippery body fluid. It's one of the serous fluids, just like the pericardial fluid or the peritoneal fluid that surrounds the gut. And so this layer helps to reduce friction as the lungs inflate and deflate, so that as the lungs get larger and the tissues between of the chest cavity wall and the lungs are sliding past each other, everything goes smoothly. There's no hitches or catches or any scraping that could potentially happen. All right, so let's talk now about how we ventilate the lungs, pulmonary ventilation. Inspiration is the act of drawing air into the lungs. Expiration is the act of forcing air from the lungs. You're probably used to some different meanings associated with those terms, but that's how we use them when we talk about the respiratory system. So inspiration is the same thing as an inhalation. Expiration is the same thing as an exhalation. And just like blood, air moves from an area where there is high pressure toward areas where there is low pressure. So if we think about atmospheric pressure, 760 milligrams mercury, if you're watching the weather, you may see atmospheric pressure described in inches, so 29 point something to 30 point something are kind of normal atmospheric pressures around these parts here. So atmospheric pressure versus the pressure that we can create inside the lung cavities. So the differential in the pressure is what either causes inspiration. If we reduce the pressure inside the pulmonary spaces, then we're going to see inspiration as the higher pressure, 760 millimeters mercury, pushes air into the body. And then when we increase pressure, so by squeezing down on the pulmonary spaces, then that will help to push air from the lungs, causing expiration. Okay, so how do we do this? And there's kind of two tricks associated with inflating the lungs. And the first trick is that we've got to make a low pressure space inside the chest cavity, in the thoracic cavity. And so there are two ways that we create this low pressure space, and they all relate back to a physics principle known as Boyle's law. So if we have a sealed chamber that can change its volume, pressure and volume then have an inverse relationship. And so every time we increase the volume, so as volume increases, here's the inverse relationship, pressure decreases. And vice versa, if volume were to decrease, well then pressure there increases. So reverse or inverse relationship. When pressure increases, volume decreases. When volume increases, pressure decreases. Okay, I think I got that said right. So let's imagine then the thoracic cavity. So here we are in the thoracic cavity. Here's the mediastinum. And so we've got the two pleural cavities here. And this is the diaphragm here at the bottom. And when the diaphragm is relaxed, it is like this. It bows upward. That sheet of muscle is longer, and so it kind of bows upward. But when the diaphragm contracts, so you can imagine down below, here we have the abdominopelvic cavity. So here we are again, abdominopelvic cavity. So when the diaphragm contracts, it goes from being slightly bowed upward, that's where it was, to being flat. So when that happens, because nothing else is changing here, the volume of the thoracic cavity increases. So as diaphragm flattens, volume increases. And so if volume increases, what's going to happen to pressure inside the thoracic cavity? Well, it's going to get lower. And so this is going to cause a reduction in the air pressure, and it causes air then to flow into the lungs via the trachea. So we have two lungs. The trachea then will deliver air to the lungs. But wait, all we've done is increase the size of the thoracic cavity, so we're not quite finished yet. Now, if we take a really deep breath, the external intercostal muscles, those are the muscles in between the ribs, the external intercostal muscles cause the rib cage to elevate. So when you take a really deep breath, those external intercostals contract, the ribs rise, and that further increases the volume of the thoracic cavity. So now we've made it extra low pressure inside there. Okay, so there's the first trick. We inflate the lungs, or we get closer to being able to inflate the lungs by first enlarging the size of the thoracic cavity, which then in turn enlarges the sizes of the pleural cavities. Okay, so that only gets us halfway there though, because we've made the pleural cavity larger. How do we get the lungs to expand to fill the pleural cavity space? Well, that's the second trick to inspiration. I'm just going to draw a single pleural cavity here. So here's the bronchus coming in. Now, the lung is very closely associated with the wall of the pleural cavity. We've got just a thin, like several molecules of pleural fluid probably are separating the two serous membranes of the lung. And so the water molecules in there, they have a really unique characteristic. They, because of the way the electrical charges work around the oxygen, that's the large atom here, and the two hydrogens, those are the smaller atoms, the hydrogen end of water takes on kind of a positive charge, while the oxygen end takes on a kind of negative charge. And so if we've just got a few molecules of water that are separating, oh gosh, really stop that, that are separating the two pleura, then there is enough electrical attraction between these molecules that the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura wind up being bonded together by the surface area of all of those membranes. So they hold them together so that as the size of the pleural cavity increases, the diaphragm pulls downward, the rib cages pull up and outward. As the pleural cavity increases in size, it drags the bonded lungs, it stretches them, and so now the low pressure, rather than being found in this pleural space, because there is no real pleural space, that low pressure winds up in all the alveoli that are making up the spongy consistency of the lungs. So we transfer that low pressure space into the alveoli, into the inner passageways of the lungs, and because they're all connected directly to the exterior, then that low pressure sucks in all the air from the external environment down into the passageways of the lungs. So we reduce air pressure from about 760 millimeters mercury to about 740 millimeters mercury, about a 20 millimeter decrease in pressure, and that draws the air into those lower pressure spaces in the lungs. So we talk about compliance. That's a term that relates directly to lung function. And compliance is the ability for the lungs to expand, the ability for them to do their do that stretching open to create the low pressure areas. So one of the effects of many lung diseases is that we reduce the compliance of lung tissue. We reduce the ability for the lungs to be able to expand and to create those low pressure spaces inside the passageways. Okay, hopefully that made sense. Now, if that does not make sense to you yet, we need to talk. We did a demonstration in lab last night that showed how the visceral and the parietal pleura will bond together, and that demonstrated a little bit about how low pressure draws air into the low pressure area. So I can do a reprise of those, or we can talk more about it if you have questions. Okay, so that explains how we get air into the lungs, how do we get the air back out? That is, how do we do expiration? And it's primarily a passive process, expiration is, and it's done as the elastic fibers of the lungs are released from the stretch that they were put underneath because the diaphragm relaxes, the external intercostal muscles also relax, and then the elastic fibers, they rebound or recoil, and the lungs return to the resting volume. So all of this creates increased pressure that forces the air out of the lungs. The diaphragm is pushed back into its dome shape because as the compressed abdominopelvic organs kind of rebound, that shoves the diaphragm back upward into the lungs or toward the lung space. So that compresses everything. As we begin to increase pressure, then we see a decrease in the volume of the size of the lungs, and all of that, it creates more pressure that pushes the air right on out of the lungs. And then to really do an extreme exhalation, you can contract the internal intercostal muscles. These are found on the inside of the ribs. And as they contract, they pull the rib cage closer to the spine, downward as well. And we really contract on the abdominal muscles, and that further pressurizes the organs of the abdominopelvic cavity to keep pushing the air, the diaphragm upward, and so we can even force more air from the lungs if we really compress down on both the abdominal muscles and the internal intercostal muscles. So mostly a passive process is from the recoil of the elastic fibers, but we can make it active by squeezing down with the abdominal muscles and the internal intercostals. All right, so that now leads us to a conversation about lung volumes. So first, let's get some definitions out there. A respiratory cycle, that's one breath in, followed by a breath out. So that's one respiratory cycle. And the respiratory rate is generally measured in minutes. So it's the number of breaths that one takes during a minute. Adults have somewhere between 12 and 18 respiratory cycles per minute. Children at rest, 18 to 20. Smaller bodies equal more respiration. You look at a shrew or a bird, and they're breathing. They're doing a lot. So the smaller the body, the more the respiration has to happen. So tidal volume is the amount of air that's moved in and out of the lungs during one of these respiratory cycles. And so if we put some constraints now on tidal volume and say we're talking about resting tidal volume, well, resting tidal volume is the amount of air that you breathe in and out when you're just lounging around, sitting in a chair, relaxed, calm. That's the amount of air that is pushed out of or drawn into the lungs and then pushed back out of the lungs. So tidal volume at rest is approximately 500 milliliters. That's a half a liter. But that's average. Your mileage may vary. Women tend to have smaller lungs, and shorter people have smaller lungs. So size and sex both have a large influence on lung sizes and lung volumes. So if you do a resting tidal volume kind of breath in, get in your 500 milliliters, and then you really raise really get the external intercostal muscles engaged, and breathe in as much as you possibly can, we talk about the inspiratory reserve volume. That's the additional beyond tidal volume that you can breathe in. And the average is about 3,000 milliliters, but again, depending on your size and your sex, that number is going to be different. So when we have breathed in all the air that we can possibly breathe in, we're looking at both of these numbers put together, 3,500, give or take, mils. milliliters. So that's 3.5 liters of air that we can breathe in when we do a maximal inhalation. So it's the resting tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve volume. Okay, so now if you're just sitting there and you're doing a resting exhalation, so you exhale 500 milliliters of air, and then you really clamp down with the abdominal muscles and with your internal intercostal muscles, you can force out a lot more air. That's the expiratory reserve volume, and it equals about 1,100 milliliters. And then finally, there is, because of all the cartilages that are holding much of the lung space open, the fact that the alveoli remain a little bit open as well because of all the elastic fibers, because of all those things, there's an amount of air that you cannot breathe out of the lungs. You can't force it out. And that's approximately 1,200 mils, 1.2 liters, and that is referred to as residual volume. So that's the amount of air that you can't force out of the lungs. All right, so those are the volumes. So let's talk now about capacities, where we add together some of the volumes to get a sense of how well a person's respiratory system is operating. And the first capacity we'll discuss is called vital capacity. And this is the total amount that you can breathe out after you've breathed in everything that you can breathe in. So it's the tidal volume, which would be about 500 mils, half a liter, plus the inspiratory reserve volume, which, remember, was about 3,000 or 3 liters, and the expiratory reserve volume, which was about 1,100 milliliters. So you add all three of these together, 3,000 plus 1,100 is 4,100, plus 500 is 4,600 milliliters, or almost, 4.5 to 5 liters is what we're talking about as the vital capacity. The total amount that you can draw into the lungs and then squeeze it all out again. So that's vital capacity. The inspiratory capacity is the most that you can breathe in at one time. So that would be the tidal volume, that regular little breath, plus the inspiratory reserve. So 3,000 plus 500, or 3,500, 3.5 liters. Now, if we talk about the residual capacity, especially the functioning part of the residual capacity, then that is the expiratory reserve and the residual volume. So this is after you've done a tidal breath out. How much air is still in the lungs? That's the functional reserve. It's expiratory reserve plus residual volume. So since expiratory reserve was 1,100, residual about 1,200, add those together, 2,300. So 2.3 liters, or 2,300 milliliters. Total lung capacity, that's our vital capacity plus the residual volume, that part that we can't breathe out. So we take vital capacity, 4,600, add 1,200 to it for a total of 5,800 milliliters, or almost 6 liters, 5.8 liters. All right, so do the capacities make some sense? I've got a couple of more capacities to discuss. Functional reserve is just how much after you've done a tidal breath out. Total lung is everything, including that residual volume. Okay, so go a little bit deeper. There are also some dead spaces, some bits of air that never get breathed out. So the first of the dead spaces is what's referred to as the anatomic dead space. So it is the residual volume found in the passages where no gas exchange is occurring. So it's dead space because it's just in places where there's no capillary network to pick up blood where there's the wall of the respiratory passage is so thick that no oxygen can diffuse out or CO2 can diffuse in. So we're looking here at just that area where no gas exchange can occur. And of the 1,200 or so residual volume, 150 mils of that is anatomic dead space. Now, sometimes people have alveoli that are non-functional, so there's no blood flow to them, no capillaries there to pick up oxygen or drop off CO2, and so they are just alveoli that are not doing anything for us. This is another kind of dead space. So people who have had some sort of lung trauma may develop alveolar dead space, just alveoli that cannot do their work. So we have anatomic dead space. That's where the amount of air in the areas where no gas exchange is occurring. Alveolar dead space, that is the amount of capacity, the volume of air that is in alveoli that don't work. And then there is physiologic dead space, which is summing these two together. So 150 plus whatever volume of alveolar dead space there is. So in a healthy person, physiologic dead space is just 150 milliliters because there is no alveolar dead space. So in a person with healthy lungs, none of the dead space is down in the alveoli because all the alveoli are working. But physiologic dead space in people who have lung disorders, COPD, other things that prevent the diffusion of oxygen out of the air and into the blood, and the diffusion of CO2 from the blood into the air. So if you have a condition that causes the development of alveolar dead space, then it'll be something greater than 150 mils. Okay, and then there's two ventilation terms. There's the minute ventilation, and that's the total volume of air moved into the respiratory passages every minute. So if we have somewhere between 12 and 18 breaths per minute, so here's the breaths per minute. So we could choose a number. We could say 14 breaths per minute. If each one of those breaths per minute had 500 mils in it, then we would be talking about 7 liters. So the book gives us approximately 600 mils or 6,000 mils, and that's because they're going with that 12 breaths per minute number to determine minute ventilation. So you would just take however many breaths there are in a minute and multiply that by the tidal volume of each breath. And then alveolar ventilation, this is the volume of new air that can reach the alveoli every minute. And this is a harder one to measure. But again, you want to look at tidal volume and take subtract from it the physiological dead space, that area that is going to always be non-transferring for oxygen and CO2, and multiply that number by the breathing rate per minute. So that's alveolar ventilation. Tidal volume minus physiologic dead space times breathing rate. So we would take tidal volume is 500, and the physiologic dead space is maybe 150. Then we're looking at 350 as the alveolar ventilation if we multiply that by 12 breaths or 14 breaths per minute, depending on whatever the right number is. All right. So there are also some non-respiratory air movements that occur as part of lung function, and they include coughing, which clears the lower respiratory tract, so where we are coughing air out of the lungs; sneezing, which will clear the upper respiratory tract, and the sneeze comes out the nose; laughing, which is all about expression of happiness, but it's certainly air movement; crying, that it's interesting. It expresses sadness generally, but the movements are all very similar to laughing. Hiccups, which are strange, uncomfortable, sudden inspirations that are caused by spasmodic contractions of the diaphragm. So you get spasms of the diaphragm that cause the hiccup, and it's all happening with the glottis closed. So you kind of draw in air through a closed glottis that parts just briefly, and nobody really understands what happens with hiccups. We don't really get what the function for a hiccup might be. Yawning, again, it may help to maintain alertness, so it may do some stuff in the brain to keep alertness going. But in social groups, yawning is contagious. I hope I didn't just make you yawn and feel tired, but maybe you're now a little more alert. And then last of all, speech and singing, all the things that are about vocal communication. I love the book's terms, intermittent modulated exhalation. So it's just using the control of the respiratory system to create sounds by making vibrations at the vocal folds. All right. So, as you want to think about speech and the function of the vocal folds, I would definitely encourage you to go to YouTube and search for Steven Tyler. Yes, Aerosmith. Woohoo! Steven Tyler and vocal cords. And you will see about a 10-minute clip from a National Geographic documentary that's looking at the body. It's called Incredible Machine. And that documentary, that clip, looks at Steven Tyler's vocal cords as he is singing and talking and speaking right after he had some surgery done to his vocal folds when he ruptured one or got some bleeding or nodules or something like that. So it's a cool look at vocal folds in action, how quickly they can vibrate and pound against each other, and the damage that it causes for people who do a lot of speaking and singing and other extreme uses of their vocal folds. Okay, so see you in the next video.